Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Grant and this is CNM Glass. This is a quick video for our coding overview on Coding with Ms. Melanie segment, review of Coding Clinic and questions from the class for our spring 2020 term on Coding Clinic on February 18th, 2020. Now this video may be used in future classes as a great reference because I found some of the questions that students tend to have are common over time. So if you're watching this during the current session or a future one, keep in mind that some of the questions we review may pertain to you. So let's take a look at some of the things we had come up this week, either during Coding Clinic or some of the questions I've had in general. While I do this, I'll go ahead and put the microphone on because that tends to help. Our key points this week. One of the biggest questions I've had is questions on abstracting. What am I abstracting? How do I know what I'm looking for? How do I find this information? How do I read a doctor's note? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that, which applies to all of our coding classes. Also applies to knowing how your coding system breaks down. What are the different kinds of categories? Everything's a little different depending on where you're at. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to identify that. Queries, query. Always know our queries. When to query, how to identify a query in even a learning environment. And then some of the specific questions we've had this week in classes for 10-15 and 2021, which will be done in a separate video segment. So let's get started. Now, the first thing that I wanted to talk to you all about is on abstracting. And I've thrown a couple things here on the board just to kind of put some ideas in your head. I know I've talked about this in other segments, but just in case you haven't seen them, or sometimes it's good to refresh and talk about it because sometimes it makes more sense the third time we review it or a different way that we state it. But what I always say to students and to coders in general is always pay attention to who is your provider or service that you're coding for. This is especially important in our learning environment because we're doing a specific learning module on a specific topic, and that's our provider, whatever that topic is. So if we're in radiology, then our provider is a radiologist. If we're doing coding for integumentary, then our provider is a dermatologist. And in the coding world, it's very similar. You're going to be listing your provider based off of that service. Now, some of my classes are looking at an overview, and so they may be looking at a variety of different providers and services. But keep in mind, what type of coding am I doing? What is the service I'm looking for? If, for example, you're in ICD-10-CM, specifically, you're a diagnostic coder. And so the information that you should be looking for is abstracting information about the diagnoses, the symptoms, and the conditions the patient came in for. If, however, you're in one of our procedure classes this term and you're looking at, say, PCS or CPT, then you're looking specifically at the procedure that is being done, or in CPT environment, an office visit or E&M code, because they're not always in an office. So it's important to say, what is it that I need to look for? Because if I'm over here looking at diagnoses, there's going to be information about the visit itself, where they were located, why they came in, what their exam was done. None of those information is important to me if I'm just coding diagnoses. On the same token, while the diagnosis may be important to the overall visit, it may not be the main thing that I need to look at if I'm coding an office visit. And if I'm doing a procedure, I may not even care about their symptoms if it does not affect the actual procedure itself. So these are just some things to keep in mind as you're looking at it. Your top number one thing for abstracting is identify your provider, identify your service, what it is that you're trying to code for today's service. Once you've done that, one of the things that helps is pulling out your code book and breaking down the types of service that you're coding. If, for example, you're looking at PCS coding and you're trying to determine the type of surgery which applies to root operations, you should first identify the different types of root operations you're looking at that week, or in a coding world, the different types of operations that are available for different types of surgeries. On the same token, if you're looking at diagnostic coding, you should look at the different types of condition chapters and pay attention to how that breaks down for each particular chapter when you look at a diagnosis code. Those are going to change depending on what it is and what it needs. And if you're looking at CPT, same thing applies. Right now we're looking at E&M codes. And so the types of office or other locations is very important because each of those has its own breakdown. And depending on that breakdown, if the patient is new or established or some other qualification that that code requires, it's important before you abstract to know what are your breakdowns. How does it apply to your code so that when you're looking at your documentation, you can abstract the necessary information for the code that you need. Now, that being said, how does your coding system classify this service? All falls into that breakdown. Use of a medical dictionary or Google. Now, with Google, I always like to say this fun little ploy of words, she's your friend, but never marry her. What that means is you can Google all day in medical coding, but more often than not, the codes that you're going to get are very unspecified or unspecific. And just like a coder's job when you're looking in a code book is to determine the most accurate and specificity as possible, I always stumble on that word, the highest specificity as possible, meaning the most specific, the most detailed code that's available. When you Google something, it's not going to give that to you. What Google can do is she can answer questions about what is the medical definition for this word here that I don't know out of my abstracting notes. And you may find as you're looking at some of these, especially in our procedural coding and especially in PCS, where we go very anatomic and very specific, you may be looking up words quite a bit, but that's how you learn. If you look up cholangiopathy or cholangioscopy 6 times, I guarantee you by like maybe the 7th time you'll have an idea of where it's at. And if not, you keep looking it up and that's okay. I still look up terms to this day to make sure that I have the fullest grasp of the term that I'm looking at if it's something I'm not regularly coding, because the more we use it, the more we do remember. But when we're talking of hundreds of thousands of codes between all of our coding systems, nobody is expected to memorize our codes or remember everything there is to know. What you are expected to understand is how to read it, how to put it together, and how to identify it so that you can select the most appropriate code. And all of that being said, don't be afraid to query. A query is done to a provider typically when there's not enough information to select the code. So you've abstracted the information to determine who is your provider, what is your service. You looked at the definitions of the services, and something in the code requires more information than the provider listed. This is considered an uncodable service until you get more information. And the best thing to do is to query the provider as soon or as early as possible. In a learning environment, consider me, your teacher, like a provider. If you ever come across something that does not give you the correct information or all the information you need, or let's say that you're reading through a scenario where a patient is stung by a wasp and then the doctor starts talking about their allergy to bee venom when there's clearly 2 separate codes. Hint, hint, this was an actual question this week in our 1015 class. In an instance like that, you should not be coding the bee or the wasp because it's inaccurate information, it's not cohesive, and something is not accurate. So I will accept the answer for a query to that, or even an email where you can say, hey, this doesn't match, can you help me out? This is going to happen in the real world, and so this is great experience opportunities for you. When you run into things like this, look at it as an opportunity to reach out and say something's not right. If it's in Evolve or one of our online resources, I'll make sure to give some feedback to the entire class based off of that. Speaking of, let's go ahead and this video will end, but make sure you watch our second video if you're in one of our specific classes for 1015 or 2021 on some of the coding questions we had specific to this week. Now, I'm not going to have very long videos this week, but as we go forward, expect more of these as we get more questions and more concerns that are brought up. We'll talk to you soon.